monsters and ghosts to otherworldly beings. Join the explorers as they venture into the darkest realms, seeking the truth to what goes bump in the night.
Good evening and welcome to Explorers Secrets of the Truth, episode 28. I am, of course, Chad Charlesworth, and with me, as always, is my best friend and co-host, Les Sincavage. So, how are you doing tonight, buddy?
Very good. Apparently, we're both extremely tired as we're both stumbling and bumbling. We pre-show, Chad and I were talking, and we were fighting. It seemed like we were fighting to get a word out. Just that's how tired we are. So we apologize in advance if we're stumbling over words or anything tonight. But we both had an extremely long week. So no sound. You can't. Can anybody else hear us? We should have sound. I don't know. Well, hopefully you all could hear us because I don't think anything has changed since the last time. Anyway, but other than being tired, we are very good. I am very good. But I'd like to welcome everybody to the show, and we're pretty excited about tonight's show. Originally, we were going to discuss personal paranormal stories or experiences. However, the more Chad and I started talking about this, well, yeah, I'll let Chad get into that. So I'm just going to go into our usual stick and let bring up the agenda. So you could reach us at our website at www.explorersgroup.com. We're on Twitter at Explorers Group, and of course on Facebook, facebook.com/Explorers Group. And we're on iTunes and a bunch of other places too, but you get the idea. Chad?
Yeah, so as Les was saying, we had originally planned on having tonight's show format cover more of our personal experiences, that we've encountered throughout our lives. But as we kind of were sending each other stories back and forth and kind of talking when we had some time this week, there was one topic in particular that really... Well, it's really a location that really kind of caught our eye and we kept coming back to. So tonight we're going to talk about a place that's in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, and it has been around almost as long as the county itself. It has been quite a few different things though throughout its existence, all of which could fuel the flames of paranormal activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this place has all the makings of a classic horror movie, I guess, if you really think about it. Its rich history stems from an almshouse, lunatic asylum. It was a hospital and is currently a nursing home for the elderly. And that place that we're talking about is Rest Haven Nursing Home in Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania. And growing up, both Chad and I knew a lot of people who worked there, all of which had some kind of a run-in with the unknown. And in fact, my mom worked there for 20 years, give or take, maybe more. I don't know, for as long as I could remember. Excuse me. And I can remember as a boy, she would tell us all kinds of freaky stories of things that she and other staff members had experienced and whatnot. And the worst part about it is she would tell us when she got home, and my mom worked 3 to 11. I guess that would be second shift. And when she would get home late, it was late at night, and she'd tell us these stories.
Yeah, and they were some lovely stories to share with us kids there, Mom. So,
right?
And before we get into the paranormal end of things, I always like to do my due diligence and give a brief history of the location. So we were lucky enough that there was an article written in the local newspaper in Schuylkill County, and it's an article on Rest Haven in the Pottsville Republican. I guess their website is republicanherald.com. The history of Rest Haven, I've always done that since I was a kid. Rest Haven goes back as far as the founding of the county, Schuylkill County itself, which is in 1811. When the county was designated as a poor district in 1831, the law required a construction of an almshouse also known as a poorhouse, to provide charitable housing and employment for people who could no longer work and pay rent in that area. Just to add a side note from this story, for people who aren't familiar with Schuylkill County, some of you guys that are watching grew up around us, so you kind of know what the county's like. Schuylkill County is basically what they consider the coal region of Pennsylvania. So there was a lot of mining and, farms pretty much is what the county was started on. People who are familiar with Yuengling beer. Yuengling is out of Pottsville, Pennsylvania, which is in Schuylkill County. But industry-wise, there wasn't a ton back then except for the coal mines. And what would happen with coal mines is if the husband died, the family was expected to provide within like 48 hours a replacement worker. Well, if that replacement worker couldn't be found, and that was why you see photos of 9 and 10-year-olds working in coal mines back then.
Yeah, breaker boys.
Yeah, if they didn't have somebody to replace the father, they were kicked out of their homes because the homes were owned by the coal companies. And therefore, if they didn't provide work, there was no rent payments. So therefore, the coal mines would kick them out of their homes. And also, back then, it was a lot harder for women to own property. So a woman couldn't have a house if her husband died and there was no heirs to the house. A lot of times the women would be sent, or the women and children would be sent to these poorhouses because there was nobody of legal age to actually take over the deed of the home.
Right.
So that was just a little side note on the area and stuff like that. And to get back into the article itself, the first building on the property was constructed.
Not to cut you off, buddy, but that's a good point that you brought up there, because if you think about it, that adds to the heartache and the suffering and just the, like, I guess more or less negative energy in the area that, if you really think about it, anybody who knows Schuylkill County really never left. But really, I mean, think about the people that had to go through a lot of that, and this, what they had experienced, and a lot of times, because of the poor conditions, there was children that were lost and other family members that were lost, and it just adds to the turmoil. Okay, that's my little side note there.
Well,
so go ahead.
One of the comments that actually popped up from Larry and Charlie Bell was about, an old mining town seems to have a lot of paranormal activity, I guess, where they live. Well, if you think about it, a lot of those old mining towns, and like Schuylkill County being a county that was pretty much mined, from end to end.
Yeah.
There was a lot of death, that mine cave-ins, explosions, cars on the tracks moving the coal, slipping and hitting and killing people. There's a lot of incidences of deaths that, that kind of theory of unfinished business. So you do have a lot of that in mining towns, and a lot of mining towns, it's not like nowadays where you have unions and stuff like that regulate safety, and you have OSHA, and you have all these different groups that regulate how things are done. Like we said, you had 8 and 9-year-olds working in coal mines because they had to keep their family in a house.
Yep.
So there's definitely a lot more, I think there's, and this is kind of another little offshoot here, but I really think when you look at paranormal activity, I think there are 3 generalized things, or I don't know how I want to necessarily word that, but there's 3 types to me that really always end up sticking out. Your town, your industry, be it coal mining or steel production or foundries and stuff like that, you have a lot of history of, unexpected death, accidental death. Then you go to what I would say would be the next area or type would be your battlefields, because you have those, all that energy of, charging into, what most people knew was they're going to be their death or unfinished business and stuff like that. So there's all that energy, all that emotion. And then the topic that we're getting into tonight, if you start to think about all the more famous locations for paranormal activity, the third area I would say that usually comes up is your asylums, your almshouses, your poorhouses, your old hospitals, basically that middle ground of medical treatment, be it the poorhouse to the fact of being a hospital at one point or another. I think, if you think about, folks that are listening, if you think about all the quick answer paranormal places, Gettysburg, St. Albans, was it Waverly Hills Sanitarium? You think about it, these places kind of pop up very quick. The Slocum Foundry down in the south is very haunted, allegedly. So you kind of Pennhurst, these places are the ones. What's that?
Eastern State Penitentiary.
Yeah. Some of your mining towns, Goldfield and stuff like that out in Nevada. These are those places that seem to just instantly, when you say to somebody who's relatively experienced with paranormal stuff, if you say St. Albans, they're like, oh, the insane asylum, the old hospital. You say Pennhurst, oh, the asylum, you say Gettysburg, oh, the battlefield, the different things. These are the ones that generally pop up in those three kind of categories. So, kind of getting back into the newspaper article, the first building on the property was constructed in 1833, and it was a three-story brick building that was, built to accommodate 150 people, which included the insane and homeless. That's one thing a lot of, with the way medical, I'm sorry, I'm diverting a lot tonight.
That's
usually what happens. That's what happens when I get tired, folks. I go off on little side stories instead of reading what I'm supposed to be reading to you. Back in those days, your almshouses and your asylums, pretty much you had anywhere from people that the parents didn't want for many different medical reasons and stuff like that, to just that, the parents couldn't handle them, all the way to your homeless, to your poor, to the criminally insane. And when you start looking at the medical definitions from back then, it is a very wide spectrum of who got put in these homes.
Right.
So, you're going to see some stuff and hear some stuff as we go through, and you're going to kind of be wondering, like, in modern day terms, these people would not be eligible for this kind of treatment or housing. Back then, it was almost like a catch-all for the unwanted people of society. Okay. So, as I'm going here, as I divert, I'm going to come back to the newspaper article. Another three-story building was constructed in 1840, followed by a two-story building for a hospital in 1842, which was later torn down in 1923. And there was a monthly average of 262 residents at the almshouse that year in 1842. A three-story building was erected in 1859 to care for the elderly. A building for the insane was built in 1869. A two-story building was erected for a bakery and a laundry in 1872, according to the Zerby History, which is a local historian in Schuylkill County area. In 1919, construction started on a new insane asylum on the hill behind
1911.
What did I say?
1919.
Oh, great.
That's
now
right.
I can't read on top of things. On the hill behind the original almshouse, although it would later be known as the 1912 building, the Schuylkill County Hospital for the Insane was actually completed and dedicated in 1913, and it was large enough to house 600 residents.
Which I have a picture of that I'll bring up for everybody.
Yeah, you can bring that up as I go through this here.
Yep. The building, just not to interrupt, but the buildings in the back in red, the red brick building is what they considered, or what they called, the 1912 buildings, which were the buildings that were most of our stories are going to be talked about those 1912 buildings, and the one to the left, I believe, is the new hospital for the insane, as it says in the inscription on the top of the picture, which that is no longer there anymore. That was demolished. Well, Chad will tell you when that was demolished, but that's a picture for you guys to see. So go ahead, Chad.
Okay, and patients were also brought from various state institutions to be cared for at this facility. A hospital building was added in 1897, and according to the Penn State Schuylkill website, the county discontinued farming operations at the site in 1961 and consolidated the remaining patients into one nursing home building on the property. The county then sold a 42-acre parcel of land to the university for $1. The purchase included 6 buildings, a large barn. The only structure acquired in the purchase that were not demolished were the 1897 hospital building, another building constructed in 1913, and a storage building, slaughterhouse building, built in 1928. Those 3 buildings were renovated and became the classroom buildings, the administrative buildings, and the maintenance buildings, respectively, at Penn State Schuylkill. So all you Penn State Schuylkill graduates just realize that's where your classrooms were in a slaughterhouse at one point.
Or a hospital for the insane.
Yeah. I can definitely tell there's been some stories in the administrative wing at Penn State Schuylkill and the maintenance buildings that go along with when it was a hospital.
I remember people talking stories about the dormitories that were built on top of the lands that used to have the hospitals on and stuff.
Well,
the new dorms.
Well, if you remember from when we were kids, the large barn and stuff like that used to be there where the dorms are now.
Yeah.
That used to be where they held the county fair.
Yeah.
When up until about the mid 90s or whatever, that's where the county fair was held. Was on that old barn and stuff. Like the barn was the back end of it.
Yeah. Kind of forgot about that. Jesus, that was a jog of nostalgia.
Well, you got to realize my dad was the chief of police for Penn State Schuylkill, and my grandfather's security company used to provide the security for the county fair back then. So,
well, yeah, you kind of were involved with all of it.
Yeah, so I kind of remember those weird little things. The current 142-bed Rest Haven facility was built next to the 1912 building in 1969. The 2 facilities operated alongside each other until the State Department of Health forced the county to close the 1912 building in 1994 due to the deteriorating conditions. According to a 1995 article in the Allentown Morning Call, at the time the 1912 building had 120 beds. Rest Haven had a total of 242 residents between both buildings. The 1912 building was eventually sold to Penn State Schuylkill in 2008, along with 33 acres and a second building that formerly used by the county child development as an administrative office. It was demolished in 2010 after fire heavily damaged the abandoned structure in the summer of 2009.
Yeah. So you can
Wow, I read all
imagine.
that.
Yeah, that's good job. Good job. But you could imagine there's a lot of history to this place. I mean, as well, I would assume a lot of pain and suffering, and death. I mean, from the almshouse, I'm sure some of the poor, when they got sick, they couldn't afford the proper medical treatment, and I'm sure the medical staff there was, of not of the best quality, because I mean they were servicing the poor. So I'm sure that the government, or the local government, didn't want to dump in a lot of money and a lot of time into people that weren't uh providing anything, you know what I mean? So, and then it went on to being just a hospital, and then the nursing home, and the insane asylum. So all those, there's death in all of that, so there's a lot of energy that has been on that ground
Yeah.
for close to 200 years.
Well, and even think about it with when it was like the almshouse and stuff. You go back to why they had to create an almshouse in Schuylkill County, because the county was considered a poor district.
Yeah.
So there wasn't even a lot of money to be funneled into care for these people. And a lot of those.
No, go ahead. Finish.
I was going to say a lot of those almshouses, like the people who lived there did the farming and the different like occupations that a small community would have, and they did that to kind of pay for their stay and their food and stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of misery and torture. And you think about, like, why did some of those people end up there? Well, it was because they lost a husband, and it was a mother with anywhere from 2 to 6 kids. And all of a sudden you went from being a family to you lost your husband to within a couple of days you were forced out of your home. And your only option for some of those people, because you got to think about it, was a big immigrant population in Schuylkill County. It wasn't like, oh, I can move down the road and live with my mom and dad and bring my kids with. It was, I have nobody in this country. My only option is to go and live on this, in this farm situation.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that too, because, and in fact, there's still a cemetery, an old cemetery behind the nursing home, that holds the forgotten remains of previous patients who were left at the facilities without any family, like you said. That, I mean, they come to this country just their immediate family. They don't have relatives and whatnot to fall back on, so they really had nobody to claim them. So they were just more or less left in these shallow graves that and actually I have a picture of, and I didn't take this picture. If it were me, I would have gotten a much better picture, but I found it online for all intents and purposes for the show. But this is part of like the back end of the cemetery, and it's literally a big giant grass circle, and there's a big stone plaque in the middle, I guess, commemorating the people. But it's literally a bunch of crude little white crosses. And when I went there, actually Chad and I went there a couple of times, way 25 years ago. A lot of the crosses were broken. Half of them weren't even put together. Some of them were just a crude little stick hanging out of the ground, and you could barely read any names. Most of the times it was just a date, or just Baby Doe was written on it. Really, really creepy. And I remember going there when we were younger, investigating and just snooping around and just, doing what kids do. And during the day, like this picture shows it during the day, when you were there, even during the day, it had the most like, just sorrow, like just the somber, ominous feeling. It was creepy. There was an energy there. And I don't want to say it was necessarily negative, like evil, but it was just this depressive, just heavy. Oh man, you remember like just going there, how it was not right.
Yeah.
And rightly so.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things, like, you go to certain places and you almost take on the emotion of the place.
Right, right.
You know, and some of these places like Rest Haven's cemetery area and stuff like that, I don't know if it's a mental thing of you're in a cemetery, so you know the people that are buried there, especially in a cemetery like that, they died in such a way or in such a fashion, like to just be buried as Baby Doe,
Yeah.
you know, or, you know, John Doe 1860 something.
Hmm.
And, you know, it's almost one of those things. Is it an emotional response to realizing like the insignificance of those people's lives? Or is it an actual, I don't want to say paranormal because I don't want to kind of cheapen it, but is it an emotional response to a stimulus from, say, the paranormal end of it? Are
Right.
you taking like empathy and you're taking on those emotions and the hurt and sorrow, and that's why you kind of feel that way when you're in those locations? There's a couple locations we've been to over the years where I've had that like in awe or very sad or, you
Yeah.
know, very torn or tormented, not by anything at the location, but the feel of being at a location, you know. So I'll have
I
to,
remember you saying that at the orphanage when we were down in Gettysburg at the, what was it, the Homestead Orphanage?
yeah,
You had
yeah,
that kind of overwhelming sense of just sorrow almost, or just,
yeah,
it was weird. I remember you telling me about it again, and even looking at you, I was like, "The hell's wrong with you?" And then that's when you kind of opened up.
yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of locations I end up, and again, that's where I don't know if it is the fact that I do the historical research, so I know what happened there, so therefore I kind of, it plays in my head as we're there.
Yeah,
Or is it something, and again, I don't want to cheapen it like, oh, it's paranormal, but is it a residual emotion from the things that happen there? And people, some people feel it differently and to different levels or degrees. Um, you know, is it something like that? Because I know for years when I would drive on Route 81 through Virginia, I would get within 20, say about 15 miles of this one exit on either
yeah.
side of it, coming northbound or southbound. And I would start to get like the scared feeling,
Yeah.
like that, you know, almost not quite an anxiety attack, but that
Like a panic.
panicky,
Yeah.
yeah, and like uncomfortable. And if I drove through there at night, it was one of those ones where I'm like checking the rear view mirror to make sure somebody's not sitting in my back seat. And
Yeah.
it would be like a 30-mile stretch of the road I would feel this. And I
Yeah.
never knew why. And when I moved down here and I was working with the newspaper, I had came up with this promo working with St. Albans Asylum.
Hmm.
And then I realized where St. Albans Asylum is. It's the exit in the middle of that 30-mile feeling that I get. It's
It's
the
kind of
Radford
odd.
exit. I didn't
Yeah.
know about St. Albans until I started trying to find a location to do this promo with. And I had never heard it, never even seen it on any shows or anything like that. I didn't watch the shows that did cover it.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, one day I'm like going down that way and I'm like, oh, that's the exit you take. As you know, I said to my wife, I said, this is where I started to get that feeling driving. And we got so far down and I'm like, that's the exit for St. Albans. Got down the road a little ways past there, no problem. But now I've kind of, that's where I get into that kind of internal debate. Where is it a residual emotion that I'm, you know, picking up on, Or is it now the fact of, like, in some of these locations, I do know the history? That was one where I didn't know the history and why I was feeling that way, but I drove through there probably 30 times before I ever knew that St. Albans was there. And every time I drove through there, I always had those feelings and always felt like panicky and stuff like that. Looking in my back seat, you know, even in the daytime, like just kind of like looking around, like in the woods and stuff like that feeling like something was gonna jump out and you know, startle you. So, in the light of tonight's topic, we decided to reach out to some of the people that we knew who worked to see if they would kind of share their stories, and thankfully they, you know, obliged us. So the first story we'll discuss is from one of our old classmates in high school, Pat Raring. Pat was an awesome guy. Yeah, I played hockey with him. So, haven't really talked to him, but yeah, we played hockey for about a season or two together. He's a real cool kid back then and stuff. And I know he's, you know, kind of got a great career going for himself nowadays. And, you know,
he had fun on senior week with us, remember? And we had a good time in senior week.
And he actually, you know, let's not get into that. But he said we could, you know, use his story and kind of quote what he had said to us. And he basically said that he can remember 2 to 3 stories about Rest Haven. So the first one, you know, he basically, this is coming from his emails back and forth with us, is remember that. What's that?
I said you'll read it verbatim as if he's telling the story, so it doesn't sound weird.
Yeah, so if I say I just realized I'm in place of Pat in this case, because we were kind of hoping Pat would jump on, but he does have children and stuff like that. So,
but we do appreciate him just sending them. Just
yeah, definitely is a big, you know, big help on this topic. So first, you know, remember that Rest Haven used to be an almshouse where no one would really take care of these people during the Great Depression. So there were many who died in there, unable to live with the loss of everything. The cemetery in the back is more expansive than you might think. It was, I got to tilt my screen a little bit here. Sorry, folks. It was then a hospital before finally becoming the nursing home. So there are a lot of uneasy souls in the buildings and areas. The 1912 building was connected to the new building by a breezeway, and we dietary aides used to park out back by the loading docks if we knew there wasn't going to be a shipment that day. We aides had 2 shifts, from 4 to 12 and from 12 to 8. I was coming in for a morning shift one day, and it was that patchy fog that just sticks to the ground. Am I doing the Christopher Walken thing again? Is that what you're...
Well, I arrived on my shift. The fog everywhere. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I do that every so often. You know, it was the patchy fog that sticks to the ground, but had the headlights stopped after about 15 feet. I'd driven up the back road and was behind the 1912 building when I swear I saw 2 nurses walking in the pitch dark without lights. But they seemed to glow slightly, and I thought they were just out for a smoke break walking around. But after a minute, thinking for about a minute, the nurses on the floor didn't wear the white World War II style uniform.
And it's funny that he shared that story, because not only he, later in the show, I'll talk about some of the stories that my mom shared with us when she worked there all those years. But the one of the common stories was of a nurse, and it was typically like a blonde nurse in an older style nurse's uniform. And on that Republican Herald write-up, on the Republican Herald site, I found a picture which I'll share, and this was basically the style of the nurses' outfits that from back in the day when it was the hospital and whatnot. And from the stories Chad and I have gathered, this pretty much fits the bill of what people were seeing throughout the halls, throughout the grounds of the hospital, up by the cemeteries, walking around, you know, the outskirts of the building. So that alone, if I saw somebody walking around at night in that outfit, whether it were a ghost or not, I would find it creepy, just the way it is. So just keep that in mind when we talk about these stories, that this is what they're describing. And anyway, he goes on then to his second story. He went on to tell us about 2 weeks after that experience that Chad had just explained. The morning crew of ladies, all in their mid-40s and 50s, went to walk over to the 1912 building during one of their breaks to check out the place. They explored over a period of like 2 to 3 days, and over each of the floors. And they had 3 floors in those old buildings and a basement. So he says they were, the worst one was right as they were coming off shift in the middle of the day. They went to check out the old chapel, which I tried to find a picture of that, because that chapel was creepy, but I couldn't find one. But as they walked down the halls, you could hear the creaks of old spring mattresses, but there were no beds left in the rooms. The buildings were vacant. You could hear the hum of incomprehensible chatter, but it was just the 4 of them, nobody else in the building. So he says that we checked out the chapel, and as we were walking down the back hall towards the new building, a marble, or like a super ball, a bouncy ball that you would get in a gumball machine, bounced from one room across the hall to the other room. It made no sound, but they all watched it. And they said that Pat had actually went to see what it was, to see if it was a ball or something, or the light playing tricks on them. He went into both rooms and they were empty. And he says it was as we were at the doors at the end of the hall and we're starting to get a little loud discussing what they'd seen, they all simultaneously heard shh, almost like the ghost librarian from Ghostbusters, he says, and they all took off running. That would be enough. If we're walking around and we all hear that, that would be enough to get the hair standing up all over me, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is, I've actually experienced something similar, not there, but actually at Eastern State Penitentiary. You know, walking through the cell blocks, you could hear what sounded like people like very low talking in the cells. And I was lucky enough to have a completely private access to Eastern State Penitentiary. In fact, there was only 2 other people in the entire entire penitentiary at that point. And wow. one of them was actually walking with me. The other one was up in an office working on paperwork. So when we went through there, it wasn't like, oh, there was a group of people and maybe you were hearing an echo from down the hall or something like that, the way sound may travel or something. Like I said, there was 3 people in the entire building. I was one of them. The other person was with me and wasn't talking. And the other person was in an office. And you could hear, as you walked by the cells, you could hear this like mumble and like talking. And the weird thing was, the sales rep that was with me at that point was female. And when we walked by some of the cells, we got so far down the one wing and you heard somebody whistle. Like that, you know, that old fashioned like 1950s whistling at a woman thing. I can't whistle, so I can't mimic it, but
like that kind of thing.
Yeah, that.
Yeah.
Like that, just that, like trying to get her attention thing. And we were halfway down the one cell block and we heard it crystal clear. We actually thought the other person that was there was trying to get our attention from the center spoke and from the hub and was trying to get our attention. So we both turned around and looked and we're like, there's nobody there. But every time we kind of like every so many cells, you could hear like people like mumble talking in those like cells. So I've experienced something similar to what he's saying there with the incomprehensible chatter going on.
Yeah,
And I would definitely say, if you walking, through a place, hearing all this stuff, hearing beds squeak and chatter and stuff like that, and then to think you saw a ball roll across the hallway and from one room to another, and then you hear somebody go, shh. Yeah, I think that would get me going a little bit. Like, I don't know if I would run, but I would definitely, the hairs would go up and I would be looking around.
right.
So,
I'm going to divert a little bit here too,
Yeah.
because he was talking about an object traveling from one room to the other. I remember before we bought the house that we have now, my wife and I were all over, actually down in Schuylkill County. Well, as you all know, because we said it earlier, I grew up in Schuylkill County. I grew up in Orwigsburg. And I wanted to move back home, and my wife wanted to go. She was in agreement. We were looking at a bunch of houses, and there was one. As you were coming into town, I guess for anybody who knows the area, from Schaefer's Harley Davidson coming down, it was right before the blinking light at Washington Street and Main Street. A couple houses up on the right. Beautiful little house, and it was old. It is old. From the 1800s, I think, is when it was first built, and it was added on and added on and added on. Like, it was very labyrinth-like, the house on the inside, and it didn't make any sense. But a lot of times back in the day, you would have a smaller structure, and over time, as families inherited and grew, they would build onto property. And this house was a clear picture of that, and it was just odd, but beautiful. It still had a lot of cool history. But point of this is, I was there. It was me, my wife, our two kids. Or no, was Maddie around at that time? Maybe it was just Lily. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Whatever. But the kids were there. And my mom and my stepdad were there as well. And we're walking through the house, and a realtor was with us. And we were going from the back area, which were the newer additions, into the front of the house, which was the original portion. And as we were coming in from, I guess, the doorway that would have been the original back wall, we stepped in, and there were two rooms off to the left. And as we were moving forward, my mom was in front of me, and I was behind her, and my daughter was all the way up in front. And my daughter ran down the hallway. My mom went past her, and as I was coming up to the next doorway, like those the child-proof plugs that you would put into a wall outlet. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
One of those things came rolling out of the room that I was approaching. Now, like I said, my daughter had gone past, my mom passed, and I was coming up on it. And I was watching, like I was looking down at the floor as I'm walking, and I could see my mom's feet. She didn't hit anything. This came right out of the room, and it wasn't fast. Like if you would have kicked it as you were walking, it would have moved quickly. Even if it bounced and ricocheted off the wall, it still would have had enough, momentum going that it would have went quickly. This just kind of looked like it was just like maybe a little kid was sitting in there and just kind of tossed it out the door, and it just tink, 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 just rolled a little bit and went right in front of me. And the realtor was standing right next to me, and I'm like, did anybody? And she's like, I'm glad that you commented on it. She's like, yes, I saw it too. I'm like, it just rolled out of the room. She's like, yes. And I said to my mom, I said, you didn't see that when you walked past? She goes, no, there was nothing on the floor. I'm like, this just rolled right out of that room. And we're all kind of like, okay. And now we really liked the house, and it was a beautiful house and everything. But I always said, like, throughout my life, pretty much every single house I've ever lived in was haunted in some way, shape, or form. Like, odd things had happened, especially the house I grew up in and the house that I lived in with you, as we talked about in the one show. But even when I lived down in Ephrata outside of Lancaster, I experienced things in that apartment. My old house in Shenandoah, again, another mining town in Schuylkill County. I experienced things there, and I had people experience that. If we have time at the end of the show, we could talk more about personal experiences. If not, we're just going to cover Rest Haven, and we'll do another show about personal experiences. Yeah. But I made a promise to myself that if I ever had kids, I would never move into a home knowingly that there was activity of any kind of sort on the paranormal side. So as soon as I saw that, and I mean, even though we loved the house, we loved it, I don't think I would have bought it for that simple fact that I couldn't willingly move my children into a home that I knew something was going on in. So that's my story. So back to Pat's story. I think this is his last one.
Yeah. So he has a final story here. Basically, he was going home after a long day from an afternoon shift. He says it was near Christmas 1997, if my memory serves me, and it was flurrying outside. And my car was parked at the dock, and as we were saying our goodbyes for the night, I started to drive behind the old building again, when this time my eyes started to water as I watched a family, a dad, mom, and kid, dressed in somber clothes, with what looked like flowers, walking from the wall of the building. Now, he also notes that there was no door right there, as they walk across the road and up towards the cemetery. My lights hit them, but the light just wasn't right. However, I knew they were not dressed for 1997, or for the cold for that matter, or had the light to see as they walked. I sat there and watched them cross and get about 5 feet into the cemetery area before they just, as he says, faded or dissolved into the night. I felt my heart beating in my chest for what seemed like forever before I started driving again. I didn't look back, and I did not park at the dock again after that. I read that story earlier today while I was smoking a cigar, and my arm hair stood up. Like, that story, like, I read that and I was like, wow, I had a physical response to just reading that story.
Right. So did I. Now, I must have read his stories and our other friends' stories that we'll be getting into. I read them probably 4 times. Over and over. Well, when they first sent me, I read them, and I read them again later. And then when I was putting them into the show notes, I read them twice after that. And you're right. When I'm reading them, I'm like, oh God. And plus I'm in my studio, so I'm not even connected to the house now. So I'm out here all by myself, and I'm always looking back behind me, the dark bathroom back there. I'm like, oh, is there something in there?
And that's why I met.
Well, yeah, because like the one time we're having the show and you're like, hey, is there something moving behind you? And now I'm always like, what? Is there something behind me?
Well, who's that standing behind you?
Yeah, don't. I already have high blood pressure. I don't need any more. But all right, moving along. Like I said before, another buddy of ours who had worked there for a while. Pardon me for 1 second. I need a drink.
Yeah.
His name is Drew Wolf. He was a few grades below Chad and I, but great guy. And actually, he stayed with me for a while when we worked together at a different job. We had a lot of good times out quadding and hanging out. And he was actually staying with us on the property where we had the supposed Sasquatch activity or potential Sasquatch activity. But he was kind enough to submit some of his stories, which I totally appreciate. So thank you, Drew and Pat, very much for sending in your stories. So let's see, where do we start? So okay, and again, I'm going to read it verbatim, so I'm reading as if he's speaking. He says, let's start out by prefacing that the rest haven of old was much creepier than the one that stands today, in reference to the 1912 buildings in lieu of the ones that were built in the late 60s, early 70s. Those buildings are still standing. That's what the home is now. So I worked at Rest Haven for approximately 4 years, from 1998 to 2001. The 1912 building was where most of the activity was experienced. I should also preface my stories by telling you that by the time I started working at Rest Haven, the 1912 building had been closed down and abandoned since 1994. So he started in 98. During my first time there, I witnessed a few things I would definitely classify as paranormal. For instance, Rest Haven would have a laundry company come in weekly to collect the soiled linens. The driver would pull behind the old 1912 building and go in through the basement to gather the dirty linens. One day, the driver was performing his normal routine, and as he was collecting the laundry, he noticed a resident wandering throughout the basement. He called to her multiple times, but got no response. He said the woman seemed to be wandering around, mumbling to herself. He quickly ran over to the new building and alerted the nursing staff that a resident had, for lack of better terms, escaped and was seen in the basement of the 1912 building. The laundryman escorted a few nurses to the wandering resident's location, while the remainder of the staff performed a head count in order to identify the resident. When they arrived back at the 1912 basement, the resident was nowhere to be found. They returned to the new building only to find out that all residents were present and accounted for. Needless to say, that particular laundryman never returned to Rest Haven. He apparently requested a new route immediately. So that's pretty cool. I mean, that would creep the crap out of me if I were just going about my business, doing my thing, and then you just see some, like, because you gotta keep in mind, a lot of the residents up there were, like gowns or outfits that could be easily managed by the staff. So you see somebody kind of wandering around there in their garb. Oh God, that would creep me out.
See, I would do really bad with that.
Right.
Like the whole like mumbling and kind of like that non-responsive mumbling, and I've done security for some nursing homes and county homes over the years, and they had wings of people who weren't stable anymore and stuff like that.
Right.
And not to be like judgy or demean these people, they creep me out. Like
well,
that whole like incoherent, mumbly
Alzheimer's.
Yeah, well,
They have dementia. They don't know where they are.
Yeah, well, my grandfather had dementia at the end of his life, and like with him, it was more of a personal, like, kind of painful thing to deal with.
Yeah.
Because every time I saw him, he would have to be told who I was, and then he would go into the exact same statement that he used every time. I haven't seen you since you were this big. How are you doing? And at first I didn't, I was 20s when he, really got bad and stuff like that. And I would be, it happened in my teens though, too. But in my 20s is when he really got bad. And I would just be like, I was here yesterday.
Right.
And then like my grandmother or my mom explained to me, like, he doesn't make that memory. Like, the time you see him is the first time he's seen you since the last time his memory has something with you in it. So that always, like, the incoherent, it's also because I watch a lot of those bad, found footage, paranormal movies over the last couple of years. And they always have that, like, incoherent speech and like the little old lady who's all like in her hospital gown with the hairs, like, that old lady hair, and she's like, and all of a sudden, like, she looks at you and it's like her face morphs. So I think I've probably poisoned myself on that whole topic. But I think that would be the one for me. Like, try to get the person help, but I would be like, look, they're in the basement. When you get down there, you'll see my stuff. They were about 7 foot away from it to the left.
Yeah, right.
And then I'd let them go, and I would follow behind them, grab my stuff, run back out the door, and leave. And that's when I would request a new route. Be like, I ain't doing that. Sorry, ain't worth it.
Yeah, I remember when my mom worked there. She worked on the I don't know what, I guess. I forget what the name of the floor was, but it was with the Alzheimer's and dementia patients. And my mom has a heart of gold to be able to help these people and to be there. My mom walked in and they don't know where the hell they are. Like there's a little old lady. I remember walking in. She's like, "My baby, where's my baby?" And she like, and I was early 20s, I guess, you know, a grown man. And I'm walking and she grabbed me and with this force of this little old lady's hand is frail. And she's like, they took my baby. They took my baby. Find her. Find her. I'm like, oh my God, let go of me. You know, I was like, you're creeping me out, lady. And I'm trying to keep composed. I'm like, you know, just, I'm freaking out. And then they're, like you said, they're walking and they're just, and my mom's like, hey, George, how's it going? Like no big deal. I'm like, no way. No way could I do that. No way.
Yeah.
But anyways, we go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I have to agree with you on that. Like, I couldn't. That would be the thing that would creep me out. Like, just, and even not even on the paranormal end of it, thinking I see somebody who's lost in a building they shouldn't be. Just the actual living human being that's suffering through that would be enough for me to be like, I can't do this. This isn't for me. I got to get out of here.
Yeah, yeah.
So. Yeah, you know, it's a sad thing.
It is. Go ahead. What's the next one there?
Yeah, he goes on to say, on another occasion, I was finishing up my shift within the dietary department, and I was on my last 15-minute break for the night. And at this time, phones, you know, cell phones were not nearly as prominent as they are today, so he had to make a personal call, and the only phone was a payphone located across the walkway and directly inside the doors of the 1912 building. And in order to get through these doors, you had to type in a code on the keypad. And as they were held shut by, you know, a magnetic system, 1912 building, it was around 7 p.m. and I proceeded to make my phone call. And about 2 minutes into my call, I heard what sounded like high-heeled shoes walking across the floor above me. At this point, I was completely ignoring my phone call and was tracking the footsteps across the ceiling. For a moment, they stopped, and I heard the door at the top of the stairwell next to me open, and the footsteps continued on down the stairs. At that moment, I heard the footsteps coming towards me. I dropped the phone and bolted through the magnetic doors without entering the code. I ran directly back to the kitchen. When I arrived, my supervisor asked me, "What the hell happened to you?" And I told her the story, and she said to me, "Oh, you met the nurse." And I said, "What?" And she told me that people have been reporting seeing a woman dressed as a nurse from the 1940s through 1950s, 59 era, walking around through the second floor of the 1912 building. She then said to me, "So you heard her coming down the stairs?" To which I answered yes. She said, "Come with me and let me show you something." I reluctantly followed her back into the 1912 building, where we made our way up the stairwell, and when we got to the top, she pointed out the doors at the very top that I had heard open wide a few minutes earlier were now chained shut from the inside with a lock. There was no way the doors had opened. Needless to say, that was the last time I went into the 1912 building alone. The 1912 building has since been demolished by Potter's Field, but Potter's Field still remains. Potter's Field is a cemetery found up on the hill behind Rest Haven for unclaimed souls and John Does from throughout the years. If you walk around the cemetery, you will notice the tombstones with no names and simply multiple baby does on them. Now,
that is creepy.
Yeah, see, I don't know I don't know if I would run from a nurse walking around, you know, in high heels, but that's just me.
Well, say it. You know, it's funny because I have a story about the nurse, and it's not paranormal related, but my mom told me that way back in the day, my grandfather, her dad, when he was young, he and a buddy went to Rest Haven. I don't know if they were meeting a friend or picking somebody up. I forget what they were doing there. And my grandfather said he saw the most beautiful nurse walk out the door. And, you know, he wanted to get to know her, you know, and he was really digging her. So he went up to her and started talking to her. And he asked her if she wanted to go out for coffee and talk and, you know, just go hang out. And she's like, oh, yeah, I'd love that. That'd be great. And this, and that. And they had a little conversation going for a bit. Then a group of nurses come barging out of the door screaming, there you are. You're coming with us. And it turns out that the nurse was actually one of the mental patients that got a nurse's uniform and tried to get out. And I said, it's funny that, you know, not only did I inherit my grandfather's name, but I also inherited his uncanny knack of picking up crazy chicks.
Well, you know, you think about it. Like, yeah, you think about it. I mean, this girl trying to escape. I mean, she had a good plan, and you know, your grandfather's thinking, "There's a hot chick. Let me see if she wants to go for coffee." No woman that you ever approach on that level, the first time you meet them, you go, do you want to go for coffee? And they go, sure, let's go.
Yeah, right now. Just get me the hell out of here, you know?
Yeah, that screams setup.
Exactly. It was funny. I was losing it because anybody who knew my grandfather, like I didn't just inherit his name, I inherited his personality and everything like that. And he was just the funniest, goofiest guy, and he was just a trickster and whatnot. And it's funny that happened to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame he didn't get to go for that coffee, though.
Yeah, right.
Well, maybe it would have been a bad thing. You never know what she was in there for.
Exactly.
So, you know, Les has mentioned, you know, that your mom had worked there for quite some time. I mean, the entire time I knew you until she retired from there, you know, I mean, that was in our 20s that she left working there, maybe later.
I think she retired when I was in my 30s.
Okay, so pretty much,
yeah.
The entire.
I don't think she hasn't been retired that long. Just maybe 6 years.
Okay,
7 years. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean that from 13 until say 6 years ago. It's a long time.
Yeah, it's been. Yeah. I want to say she was there for 18 or 20 years or something like that. Yeah. I know it was a really long time. And she ended up after she retired from there, she worked at a couple other places, but none of them had the activity like Rest Haven. But I remember talking to her when we were kids, and she would share a lot of the stories. And I know one in particular is, well, first of all, there were a lot of multiple stories, I should say. I'll start with these, where people had reported seeing monks roaming the hallways. There'd be monks that would walk in pairs.
Yeah.
And I guess that would have dated back to either, no, probably not the almshouse, but probably, well, yeah, I guess so. But the lunatic asylum was usually run by monks and stuff like that back in the early days. So they would see monks walking around, and you know, everybody would see the nurse, and I remember her telling me stories about a shadowy figure that looked like he was wearing a cape and a top hat that people would see standing in the rooms. Like if they would walk past a dark room, they would see the silhouette of. I've got a wild hair hanging out my nose. I'm sorry, it's driving me freaking crazy.
I had one of my mustache hairs in my mouth earlier, and that's why you were talking. I'm like grabbing my tongue.
God, I tell you what, having facial hair is no fun. But so they would see this character with the top hat and the cape and everything like that, just kind of roaming around, which was odd. And again, like we had said in the previous stories and stuff like that, the nurse was a very prominent figure throughout the entire building and on the grounds of the property and whatnot. But I remember the one night my mom was telling me there was a resident that wasn't doing well, and they were in a room with like 2 or 3 other people. And the daughter would always come and visit the guy. And the one aide was pushing her cart, and she was going around. She was going to give out snacks. And she went by this. She approached this room, and it was dark inside. But she could see somebody standing by the window. And she just figured, oh, it's his daughter. You know, she's been here numerous times. And she saw the figure kind of walk by the foot of each of the beds, and then this figure stopped at the foot of the bed of the man who was dying. And it just kind of, they said that the figure was just leaning over the foot of the bed, just staring at the patient. So she just assumed it was the daughter. The aide kind of went down the hall a little bit, was tidying her cart and just cleaning things up. And she's like, well, I'll go back. And then they ended up going back. The person wasn't there, and the gentleman passed away. So that was kind of creepy. I think I'm remembering that right. I don't know. I called my mom the other day to try and to go over everything, and I wanted her to come on the show and talk, but my mom's not feeling well, so she didn't want to come on the show. So I'm hoping I'm not butchering these stories. But one of the other stories that she told me is the one time my mom was a nurse there, and she was trying to find an aide to help her out, and she was walking down the hall. She had her cart, and she needed one of the girls to help her out, and she saw an aide walking down the hall in the white, outfit and stuff, but her hair was up in a bun in the back, a blonde girl. And my mom yelled down to her. She's like, hey, come here. I need you for a second. And the girl kept walking. And my mom's like, oh, well, I'm going to go get her, So she walked down the hall into the room that the girl walked into, and there was nobody in there. Another story. Yeah. Another story. There was a gentleman that worked there, and he was, I don't know what he was cleaning something or doing something, and a large black shadowy hand came out of the wall and tried to grab him. And that story I heard on a couple of occasions, where it would come out of dark rooms and try and grab people and stuff like that. So that was frightening. And imagine, like, at that time, I think I was like 10, 11 maybe. Your mom's telling these stories like, I don't want to go to bed. I was like, I'm not going to bed. But
that just reminds me of the old Scooby-Doo hand that they used to always play in the like theme music for Scooby, where the hand would come out of the wall.
That's exactly what I keep replaying in my head too. Like, zoinks,
It's pretty bad when you tell a ghost story and I equate it to a Scooby-Doo thought. But
yeah, and then I totally get it too.
Yeah.
But I remember the other story she was saying. During the winter, there was this corridor that led to a door that went out to the back of the building, and a lot of the girls would go back there and have cigarettes or smoke cigarettes. Yeah, have cigarettes. And I guess some of the kids from the college or whatever would try and go up and peek through the windows. Like, I don't know what they were looking for. I don't know if they were looking for like seeing some old lady stuff, I don't know, but they used to peek through the windows or whatever, they're creepers. And the one day a few girls were going back to have a cigarette, and as they approached the door, they could see somebody, like looking in, like they had their hands up, they're looking through the door, and they're like, oh, great. So they all go running up there to, tell them you're on private property. You can't be doing that stuff. And when they go to the door, they look out and there was nobody there, and they open the door, and it had just freshly snowed, and there were no tracks, nothing. But you could still see like the handprint and like the face of the person like leaning against the window. They were totally creeped, and they ran back into the building. Another occasion, my mom was telling me the third floor of the 1912 buildings, the elevators, there was a lock on it, or like a stop where it couldn't go to the third floor. The doors wouldn't even open. So one of the ladies that worked there, I have a burp coming on. Excuse me. One of the ladies that worked there, she went in the elevator. She hit the button for the basement because she had to go down and get some stuff out of the basement. Well, she gets in the elevator. The door closes. She hits the basement button. Then all of a sudden, the elevator starts going up. And she's like, this is kind of weird. I hit the button, and it goes up to the third floor. And she's like, all right, well, she wasn't thinking much of it because it wouldn't go beyond. Well, it got to the third floor, and the door opened up, and she said all she saw was a long, pitch black hallway. And she's hitting the close button, trying to get the door to close. And I'm sure it was only a few seconds, but to her, it felt like an eternity because it's just this black abyss of nothing. Now, she didn't see anything from what I was told, but it was just the simple fact that the elevator, there's a physical stop where it can't even get to the third floor, but it did. And not only did it get up there, but the doors open and those doors are supposedly locked.
Huh.
So that alone, that would have scared the life out of me. That would have been it right there. I probably would have died in that elevator. But the one time my mom she was on the second floor working. She was in, I guess, the nurse's station, and she was doing paperwork and, you know, getting the charts ready to do her rounds. And she, you know, she's there doing her stuff. And I guess there was like a thunder and lightning storm or something like that night, and the power was all sketchy. And she was working, you know, then all of a sudden the lights went out and she heard what sounded like people moving around upstairs. Lights came back on. She didn't hear anything. So she starts doing her work. All of a sudden the lights went out. And then she heard what sounded like somebody dragging like a metal chair across the floor and everything. And she said she was terrified because the third floor was off limits. Nobody was allowed up there. And supposedly there was nothing in there. Like, it was completely empty. There shouldn't have been the sound of chairs and all this. And it wasn't like she was hearing it from another floor or another room around her. She said it was right above her. Like, I mean, you know, when something's above you, you know, and I know my mom wouldn't make something like that up, you know? So there's so many things, like they were saying about how, like, even in the new building, like most of the activity was in the old 1912 buildings, but even in the new building, they said after a while, after, you know, everybody got, you know, comfortable and whatnot in the new building, elevator doors would open and close on their own without anybody working them. They'd go up and down without anybody controlling them. Sometimes like the locked doors that would have alarms would open, like the alarms would go off, but there'd be nobody around them. Just a lot of really, really crazy shit that went on in that place. That just, it's nuts to think. Like, I don't know. I always wanted to try and have my mom talk to one of the supervisors or the superintendents or whatever they are at the home, to see, because the old buildings were they were abandoned, so it's not like there were residents in there. And I always said, please, can we go up there and investigate? Can we check it out? Can we do? And they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't let anybody up there. But we still can take a trip up to the old cemetery sometime and just do a session up there. I'd love to. I know when I was involved with Prey, one of the paranormal groups I was, well, we were both with Prey.
Yeah. I was there a short time.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until later. I think it was like one of the first trips that I went on with them. We went to Peach Mountain that we talked about before, I think, in one of our other shows. And then we went to the cemetery at Rest Haven, and it's still creepy.
Yeah.
Still very creepy.
I remember the story about the monks. I don't know if I remember from your mom telling me or if I heard it from other people over the years. But at some point, wasn't Rest Haven connected to the orphanage? Not physically connected to the orphanage. But wasn't there something years ago, like the Catholic orphanage that's down the street from the high school? The big orphanage.
Oh, well, from Blue Mountain High School?
Yeah.
Going into Orrigsburg?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's an affiliate. St. Francis. It used to be St. Francis Orphanage.
For some reason, I think St. Francis had something to do with Rest Haven at some point. It might not have been Rest Haven, the nursing home, but at some point, I think they had something to do with the operation. I
think when it was the almshouse, a lot of the kids, like when the parents would pass, rather than staying at the almshouse with adults, they were sent down to the orphanage.
Yeah, there was something there. That's why the monk story always kind of stuck out to me. But I remember even my dad being the chief of police for Penn State Schuylkill. Back in the day, they used to actually patrol up to around Rest Haven and stuff like that, and getting calls from staff members, can you guys come up here and check this out? We had, stuff going on. We saw somebody out here. There shouldn't be anybody out there, and they would go up and check it out for them.
Yeah.
So I remember that, but I also remember stories of, things that happened at Penn State Schuylkill in the the original buildings that were purchased from the almshouse and stuff like that.
Mhm.
The old slaughterhouse and people.
Didn't your dad say the one time that stuff used to move all the time in there, like chairs would move across the room with nobody touching them and whatnot in the administration building? I remember, because I remember we were talking about him talking to him the one time at the old house, because we were talking about ghosts and some of the stuff. Remember, and we were sitting downstairs and he was like just talking about weird shit that he experienced, not just at that house, but throughout his life.
Well, they had problems with like office doors, like would be locked, and the administration would leave and stuff like that. Like some of the higher ups would lock their office doors, and security and the police department would go through the different buildings and check to make sure doors were locked and offices were locked up properly and stuff like that, especially in administration, because there's a lot of paperwork and stuff, people's personal information are stored in those areas. And they would go through at like, say, 5:30 after everybody left the offices, and they would check the locks, and at 5:30 all the doors would be locked properly. They would go back, say, at like 7 or something like that, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and they would find doors open, like unlocked and open. And they would go in thinking like maybe the staff member came back and had had to go do something and came back or something like that. And they would find nobody in there. They would find like people's chairs, like where, your desk chair would usually be pushed into your desk or around your desk. They would find them on the other side of the desk, facing like where the person would normally sit and stuff like that while they were on their rounds and stuff. And I mean, the kids and stuff, over the years had stories of seeing, people that, walking through like the hallways and stuff at night that shouldn't have been, like locked hallways, like, a door with a window, and that door's all locked up, and then the other side's locked up, so you can't get in from that end. And they would see people walking through that hallway, get to the door, and just kind of dissipate at the door. Now, again, these are college kids, so I don't know how much of the story is, you get a folklore, you have a historic property like that. Do you start to develop folklore and this class tells a story, the class after them upgrades the story, and it's that bigger, faster, scarier monster story.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of history to that location. And, as we were talking, going back and forth with the stuff, and when you're like, how about we just, because we had talked about doing Rest Haven at some point and stuff like that. And tonight just seemed to kind of fit with, there was a lot of good stories that our friends who work there and family members who have worked there could provide. So I would love, to have been able to go investigate some of the older buildings and stuff like that, or
that would have been great.
Even growing up with pretty much access to run around Penn State Schuylkill, if I would have known now if I knew then what I know now, I think I could have had a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, and like I said, my mom worked there for a long time, and one of the stories too that she was telling me is she was walking down the hallway the one time and she heard somebody call her name, and she turns around and there was nobody there. She's like, all right, well, maybe she's just hearing something. So she started walking down the hallway again, and she heard the voice call out her name, but it was closer, and she turned around, there was nobody there, and she said she took off running. So I mean, I wish. I mean, she and I talked about them, and I wish I would have wrote them down. But there were so many stories, and you're right. I think if we had the opportunities, if the buildings were still intact, I think now we probably would have had the opportunity to get in there and look around. But unfortunately, that ain't happening. Oh gosh, sorry, yawning.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been an interesting, even even just not to do like paranormal investigation, but just to be able to walk around a historic building and a historic property like that and have access, to these buildings and, get to see what people, see the places where these stories happened. They get a better appreciation for the story. Like the elevator story you were telling earlier, in Mark Nesbitt's one book, I think it was the second Ghost of Gettysburg edition.
I think I know exactly what you're going to say. And that story reminds me of the one I said too. Every time, instead of going up to the top of the building, it went down. Am I okay? Go ahead. You can tell it.
Yeah, in his book, Gettysburg College, in the one administrative building, there's an elevator, and two ladies late evening were getting into. I think it was like fall because it was already dark out and it was evening, and they were getting into the elevator to leave for the night, and they hit one. To go to the ground floor, and the elevator starts going down, and it goes past one, and it goes to the basement. And when the elevator doors open in the basement, they see what is a Civil War field hospital that actually, in historic terms, was actually in that basement during the Battle of Gettysburg. And they see these people, the surgeons operating litter carriers, people on the gurneys and stuff like that. And one of the surgeons actually looks at them and motions to them to come help him. They actually reported it to campus police, and the campus police officer went over and investigated, thinking it was a class prank for the graduating class, figuring maybe they set up a skit and, the elevator opened, they kind of messed with it a little bit to hold it open for a while, and they had all these kids playing parts, and they went in and found that none of the doors were unlocked to get into the building, and the fact that the basement was again one of those ones where you had to have special, I think at that point you had to have a key in the elevator to open it up on the basement. Like to go to the basement, you had to turn a key, and to open the doors, once you turn that key, it would allow the doors to open on the basement area. But they never found anybody involved with it. So, and that was actually featured on Unsolved Mysteries years ago.
Right.
They actually did the reenactment and stuff, and they interviewed Mark Nesbitt and stuff like that because he is the one that wrote, the book that had contained the story. But, I
actually have the Unsolved Mysteries Ghost editions on DVD, and I'm going to go back through because I love that one. That one always creeped me out.
Try to find the one with the lady who gets in trouble from her husband for moving his Civil War, those little die-cast soldiers.
Miniatures, yeah.
Find that one, and I would, because I've looked for it and I cannot seem to ever find it. But that was a very interesting one. Also, this has nothing to do with the story for tonight. But if you find it, let me know so I can actually try to find out what episode it is. But
I'll let you borrow the DVDs.
Well, I have the whole 9 seasons of it or whatever that came out. Actually, access to it. I just need to know what episode it is because I go scrolling through and a lot of it's random. So
I'll find it after the show. I'll look through my DVD case there.
Cool.
So
that one with that guy standing.
Yeah, right back there. Yeah, Lloyd. Yeah, Lloyd Christmas. So I guess do we want to end the show now, or do we want to talk about some more personal stories? It doesn't matter to me. I mean, we could always save it for another show.
Well, I'm always of the opinion we save it for another show.
Yeah, because honestly, I'm falling asleep. I'm getting really tired. So
yeah.
All right. Well, you know what?
I think doing it justice, we should save it for its own episode. I think,
Right.
the people who provided us with stories tonight from their experiences, I think we should, put ours on a different topic show. So,
yeah. All right. That works. Yeah. Cause we have, other, like I said, like we said earlier today, we were planning on having this show just about personal experiences that Chad and I experienced, not together, but throughout our lives. And then we started talking about Rest Haven. It just got to the point where we're like, well, there's so much on Rest Haven. We could do just the show on that. So that's kind of where it went. So we do have other things that the house that I grew up in, just to give you guys a bit of a teaser, I guess, for lack of better terms. The house I grew up in Orwigsburg, it was 150 North Franklin Street in Orwigsburg. I don't know if I should have said that or not, but too late. It was a brand new home that my parents purchased. They were the first people to ever live in there, but the where it was located, I think, had much more history than they had bargained for. So we'll talk about that more. And Chad's got some good zombie stories that he experienced as a kid, and tune in for the next one, because actually I guess the next show we could plan on doing this, or I don't know what we have on the docket. I'll have to go back and check the schedule. So next paranormal personal stories is going to be good, with stuff that we experienced growing up, and then we'll do another one on when we're out investigating things that we had experienced and whatnot. So anyways, I'm rambling. I'm really, really tired, and I hurt everywhere. I don't know why. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you all the agenda on how to get in touch with us one more time. You could reach us at our website, www.explorersgroup.com, on Twitter @explorersgroup, on Facebook, facebook.com/explorersgroup. And that's it for me. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We greatly, greatly appreciate every one of you. And Ricky, thank you, Ricky, for the compliments there. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. All right, Chad. I can't. I'm gonna just keep sounding stupid if I keep rambling. So
again, I'd like to thank everybody for listening tonight, and I'd like to thank my co-host Les for putting together the show tonight and doing such a great show. And so until next week, you guys all be safe out there.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.